Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. We're so happy to have Mrs. Parker for our second session today, which is going to be more focused on toddlers. And it's going to be called Asking Effective Questions During Story Time. So welcome, Ms. Parker. It's a pleasure having you one more time with us.
Awesome.
So
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. Again, as Carmen shared, I am Joanna Parker. For those of you who did not attend our first session in the infant toddler track, I just got to spend an hour talking about babies, which makes me so happy. And thinking about facilitated exploration and what that looks like, right? And so with this session, we are moving into now really thinking about story time and asking questions and how we can engage children, particularly toddlers, when we are sharing books and stories, right? So I'll do, again, a brief little introduction, just in case there are folks that are new to the track. So I've worked in the field of early care and education the entirety of my career, which at this point, all the gray hair, it's been a few years. And I've really been fortunate in being able to work across sectors. So I've spent time in childcare and Head Start, early Head Start, supporting work around infant mental health, children with disabilities, home visitation, did a lot of state level work in the state of Wisconsin, and now I do some in Virginia. I'm in the DC area. And so I've been able to have my fingers in lots of different pots. And now I get to do this work for Teachstone, of where I get to train and talk about the wonderful class tool and the importance of interactions. I also do other things. Again, I still have my fingers in lots of different pots. But what is really enjoyable about that is that I not only get to talk about these things and think about research and best practice, I also get to spend a lot of time in programs, so in classrooms, in family childcare homes, and really see the amazing work that you're all doing. And I really do see my role as holding the hands of the people that are holding the babies. And at the end of the day, it is you, the people who are holding the babies, who are taking care of our children, who are so important. And the work that you do is so incredible. And I always want to remind folks that part of why we talk about interactions, part of why we have the tagline of measuring what matters with Teachstone, is the recognition that it is through those interactions, it is through the relationships that you are building with children, and just those everyday interactions that we probably don't even think twice about. You are literally building children's brains, like you're supporting connections that are happening with neurons and all of that science that I understand just enough to be awed by it, right? And so I really do want to acknowledge the amazing work that you do, and that you're here on a Saturday morning to listen to me talk about toddlers and story time. So welcome. Okay. So as we move into our content, this session is organized to be as interactive as possible. I know it's kind of hard in these platforms of where I can't see you and you can't talk to me, but you can put things in the chat, as you all have been doing, which is wonderful, right? And so I'm going to pause from time to time with some questions and ask you to share some information, right? And while I'm waiting for you to share that in the chat, I will share some of my own examples, right? So I'm feeling very fortunate because I had this pile of books on my bookshelf because I'm working on this really amazing project with the state of Virginia of where we're creating an apprenticeship to get people into the field. As we heard in the keynote, we've lost 50% of our childcare capacity. We've lost programs, but we've also lost teachers, right? And so trying to build that back up. And so I'm teaching, I take a class that I teach that is typically a year long, and we put it into 4 weeks. And so we're bringing people into the field, paying them full time, And they spend 16 hours of each work week on coursework, and then the remaining 24 hours in the classroom. Right now, it's just center-based. I'd love to be able to get folks and think about how we can support family childcare, but that's a whole other ball of wax. But anyway, so in that work and in building this course, I was able to pick the books that we send to our participants, and part of those are children's books. And so now I have, really what I did is I just picked my favorite books, right? It's really fun to be in this role and be able to do these things. So as we're thinking about what was your favorite book when you were a child, I've kind of hit the age where, I don't know, right? But I know what my children's favorite books were. So I'm going to share some of those. And some of these are more preschool-y, but so this book is one of the best books ever. 7 Silly Eaters, right? And it talks about this family that has 7 babies, right? And so it starts with the first baby, and we have these beautiful drawings of the mom and the dad and the baby, and they're talking about what the baby will eat and what the baby won't eat, right? And then what happens with each additional baby. What I love about it, as the mother of 5 children who are all 2 years apart, is that it very accurately reflects in the drawings of the home and the parents what it feels like to have a large family and have lots of babies, right? And so I love that book. And unfortunately, my children enjoyed it as well. And it's a book that I actually have given as gifts, both to children, but now I give it to adults. My middle child's favorite book was Knuffle Bunny, right, which is an amazing book by Mo Willems, who actually at the height of the pandemic did drawing lessons online through the Kennedy Center here in DC, which was really cool. And my middle child has had a bunny, and she still has the bunny, a stuffed bunny that was her Knuffle Bunny, right? And then the little mouse, the red ripe strawberry, and the big hungry bear. This is a really fun book to read because you get to get really excited and enthusiastic with the different characters and the big hungry bear and the little mouse. And again, some of my favorite books, right? And so hopefully you all are sharing in the chat some of your favorite books. And I love it, Deborah. You're like, I don't remember. I don't know. Right. So Little Red Riding Hood, Goodnight Gorilla. Oh, that's such a good one. Right. So thank you. I appreciate seeing all of these different books. Right. So we're thinking about what are our favorite books. And I think part of as we start going through our content and thinking about how we support children's engagement with storytelling is that we have to be excited about it, right? If we're not excited about the book, they're not going to be excited. And just like that poor politician reading to a room full of preschoolers a book that was not in any way developmentally appropriate, right? He probably wasn't very excited about that book by the time he got halfway through it. So I'm going to ask you to think about it, and maybe this will be easier because it's pulling on our recent memory of what are some books that you really love sharing with children and that children get really excited about, right? So again, I've got my pile here. So when I was a teacher, I worked with 1-year-olds for a while. A long time ago, they're probably all in their 30s. Isn't that depressing? But I loved those 1-year-olds, right? And one of the books that they were really fond of was Jamberry. This is an excellent book. It's got some really nice rhyming and alliteration in it, right? And so if we go through 1 berry, 2 berry, pick me a blueberry, hatberry, shoeberry, in my canoe berry, under the bridge and over the dam, looking for berries, berries for jam. And again, we've got really lovely illustrations here. 3-berry, 4-berry, hayberry, strawberry, finger and pawberry, my berry, your berry, strawberry ponies, strawberry lambs, dancing in meadows of strawberry jam. Right, again, some really lovely pictures. This book was in my head for years, right? It's probably in the last 5 years or so that I can't just say the whole thing. I have to look at the pages, right? And so some of those books that we really enjoy and that our children really enjoy, we read them a lot, right? Another book I'm really fond of, On My Mother's Lap, which is just a beautiful book that talks about being held, right? And is representing Native American tribes, right? We also want to make sure that the books that we're using, again, I love this concept of mirrors and windows that comes from the NAEYC Statement on Developmentally Appropriate Practice with their recent revision, that we want children to see themselves in the books that we're sharing. And you can actually, with toddlers, be sharing photo albums. You can share stories from your childhood, from your traditions, and particularly if your cultural background and your language is the same as that of the children, there's such rich opportunities for storytelling, and it doesn't have to be a book. Another one that has been a recent addition is I Love My Hair, right? Again, really celebrating and enjoying children, and providing opportunities for children to see themselves. And then an old favorite, right? Snowy Day. So that's my pile of favorite books. So again, I'm going to take a peek at the chat and see what folks are sharing. The Very Hungry Caterpillar, The Three Little Pigs. I was in a classroom, a preschool classroom, and they were sharing The Three Little Pigs, and you can tell that the story had been shared many, many times. And so the teacher had 3 cardboard houses for each of the 3 houses. Children were playing the role of the pig, and they had little masks. There was a child who was playing the wolf. There was a child who was the narrator. The teacher was just holding the book, and they told that whole story, and the kids were so excited about it, right? The mitten I see in there is, oh, you guys you have some great suggestions, some great books. There's just so many wonderful children's books, right? I have a colleague who does similar work as me. And she says that when she's ready to retire or she just wants a change, she's going to go work in a library as a children's librarian, because she thinks it would just be so wonderful to spend her day surrounded by children's books. Okay. So we should probably start talking about our content, though this is related. So in terms of our session today, I'm going to be sharing with you some information, and then we're going to have a video to see what it looks like, right? Because it's always helpful not only to hear the content, but to see what it looks like in action and to make those connections to your own practices. And everything that I am sharing, though, oh my goodness, we don't have the right image on the slide, I apologize. But there's a toolkit, there's a PDF that you can download that has the key ideas and the strategies for before storytelling, during storytelling, and after storytelling. And so all of the things that I'm going to talk to you about and all the information I'm going to share, you have on that handout. So this is our agenda for our time together today, right? And really thinking about this facilitation of learning and development, right? And so in our first session this morning, for those of you who were with me earlier, we really dove into facilitated exploration, which is in the infant tool, and thinking about how we support infants' exploration, right? And play and extend that, right? And so our infant tool is birth to about 15, 18 months or so. And then our toddler tool, which is where we're moving for with this session, is 15, 18 months or so up to 3 years, right? So we're really talking about some pretty broad age groups, right? A lot happens developmentally between 1.5 and 3 years. But within the toddler tool, we talk about this as facilitation of learning and development. And you can see this alignment if you're familiar with all 3 tools, right? The infant, the toddler, and the preschool. in how we move from facilitate exploration to facilitation of learning and development, and then to instructional learning formats. And for those of you who are familiar with how we think about interactions for our preschool age children, we spend a good amount of time. There are 3 domains, and one of them is all about instruction, right? And really thinking about how we're supporting cognitive development, and particularly with concept development, which folks get a little bit hyper focused on, because I think it's one of the ones that we struggle with. But some of those things that we think about within concept development for our older children actually gets folded into facilitation of learning and development for our toddlers. And so we're going to think about how through sharing books and stories with children, we can actually be supporting cognitive development as well as language development, right? And so we're going to really dive into what that really means when we talk about facilitation of learning and development. I don't know what it is about our field as early childhood educators, perhaps that we don't get that public recognition that we really need. But we tend to talk about things in ways that are fancier than we need to, right? So I think about these terms within the class tool, and sometimes I wish we would just talk about this with plain English. And that's part of what these sessions are trying to do a little better job of, right? So we're going to talk about story time, specific tips. And as I said, we will end our time watching a video example and really thinking about what this looks like. So as we move into our key ideas, and really thinking about, what do I need to know about facilitation, right? What does that mean to facilitate young children's engagement? And we're really thinking about, how do we intentionally guide children's learning in ways that helps them to make connections? And this is a really key point. And something that I think as educators, we do sometimes without realizing it, right? And so we're asking you to be a little bit more intentional. And recognizing that when we think about toddlers, or sometimes I like to talk about them as older infants, right? Their whole job, everything they're focused on, is about themselves and learning about the world, right? That they're really focused on identity. They're beginning to realize that they are their own separate person, and independence, that they want to do everything by themselves, right? And so really recognizing that how we engage older infants or toddlers and really support their learning is by making concrete connections to their lives and experiences. And I will say this is relevant for all of us, right? And our learning is to be able to make that connection to things that we already know or things that we've experienced is really helpful. But with our toddlers, it's really about making things concrete and making connections to actual objects and experiences and things that the children know, right? So that we can be really supporting that exploration and learning. And so in many ways, as I talked about in the first session, and I tell anybody who will listen to me, it really is about slowing down and noticing and being connected with the child. Because if we don't know the children in our classrooms, and if we spend our days really interacting with toddlers as a whole group, it just becomes classroom management and behavior management. And that's not a very fun way to spend your day, right? And so we need to really slow down, really notice and observe, and think about, what is it that children are interested in, and following their lead, right? And so taking us then to this key idea number 2 is relating information to children's lives and experiences supports their learning, right? And it connects to what it is that you're doing, to the materials that you've placed in the classroom, and to the experiences that you are offering that really support children learning about the world and how it works, right? We've talked about, when we think about infants and toddlers, they learn through the active exploration of their environment. Preschoolers do as well. But they're really learning about the world and how things work, and they're experimenting. And so when they put something in their mouth, when they stand on something or bang something or line things up, right? That was one of the things that I just loved in watching 1 and 2-year-olds, is that they love to dump out a bin of anything and then line those toys up in a row, right? And so maybe it's a bin of plastic animals, right? And then they line those up, or maybe it's cars and they line those cars up, and they're comparing them and doing all of these exploration pieces, and exploring the toys and the materials in ways that really is supporting their cognitive development, their discovery and learning, and some foundational math and science concepts, right? And so when we are facilitating that play and exploration and adding the language and making connections to children's lives and experiences, we're making it more meaningful and we're extending engagement. And I think part of what we're doing when we play with children, when we share stories, when we facilitate experiences as part of our lesson planning and curriculum, is that we are teaching children how to play. We're teaching children how to pay attention and focus for longer periods of time, right? Because with our little infants, they're going to pay attention to something for maybe even a few seconds, right? And maybe we can have an interaction that lasts 5 to 10 minutes. When I was with 1-year-olds, I really did feel like my day was broken into 10-minute increments, because that's about how long anything ever lasted. And as children age, we can extend their engagement in the amount of time they are cognitively able to focus on a single thing, like a book, right? So when we share books with very young children, with infants, and for those of you who were in the first session, we kind of saw that in the video, it's about manipulating the book and putting it in your mouth and turning the pages back and forth. It really isn't about us sitting down with a book and reading from page to page, right? With our toddlers, it can get to that of where, as I shared, I can be reading a book like Jamberry from cover to cover, and the children are saying it with me, right? And then maybe when they're playing in the library area, they're pulling out the book and they're reading it, because just as I memorized it, they memorized it too, right? And so thinking about how we are really supporting that engagement. And so then that takes us to our next set of key ideas, and really making that connection to, okay, we've talked about facilitation of learning and development and what that really looks like and what it is that we're talking about there, and how do we really facilitate and extend children's experiences, to then, well, what does this look like in story time, right? So we want to ask questions that encourage thinking, and involve active participation, right? So asking children about the book, asking them what they think is going to happen, recognizing that depending upon the age of the child and where that child is developmentally, the responses we might get may be limited, right? And so we really want to think about this pacing thing again. Pacing keeps coming up, right? Again, we need to slow down. And when we are asking children questions, particularly young children, like toddlers, we need to give them time to first process the question before they're even going to respond, right? And then this second key idea in terms of storytelling is that by focusing children's attention on the details in a story and helping them make connections between that and their own lives, again, we're supporting that cognitive development. We're supporting making things concrete. So, you know, if you're reading a book and there's a dog in the book, having conversations about children that have dogs at home. I was doing, actually this, oh my goodness, I haven't thought about this in years. I used to be a practicum instructor with, and now I don't even remember the university, that's how long ago it was. And so I would go to my students' practicum sites, to their classrooms, and I would observe them. And one of the students that I had was a toddler teacher with 2-year-olds. And she was able to do her practicum in her workspace. So that was really fortunate. And so this was a group of 2-year-olds that she knew well. And she actually babysat for some of the families. And so when she was sharing a book, she was asking a child about the child's dog. And she knew the dog's name, right? She knew the child's siblings' names. She knew what kind of work dad did and mom did. And so she was able to make those comments and add those really specific details connected to the children's lives. And so we have to take the time to build those relationships, not only with children, but also with their families, so that we have that knowledge, right? And we can be sharing that information. Also, if there are children in your classroom that speak a different language at home, I mean, ideally with infants and toddlers, we really want most of our caregiving and language to be in the home language, right? So if you have families that speak Spanish at home, speaking Spanish in your program. But also we have many communities that speak lots of different languages. I was, again, I keep going back to these things that were eons ago. But one of my first experiences with Head Start was I worked at a parent and child center. And a parent and child center is the predecessor, came before Early Head Start. And so we had a mixed option or approach, right? So families came to the center a few days a week, and we had a shared meal, we had some parenting activities, and we had classroom experiences. And so I was teaching in the classroom with the children when they were in our site. And then we would do home visits. And so it was really supporting families in many ways. All of the families that we were working with were recently immigrated to the United States. And they were primarily from the Vietnam area and Ethiopia. Two very different places geographically, right? And within the organization, we served families speaking over 100 different dialects. So clearly, I wasn't going to be able to speak the family's language in the classroom with the children, because children came from homes that spoke multiple different languages. And sometimes they might technically have spoken the same language, but a different dialect of that language, right? And there are a lot of political things as well going on in terms of where the world was at that point. So my other option, because I wasn't going to become a multilingualist and speak multiple languages, was to learn certain words in the children's language, right? And to be able to make those connections when I'm having conversations with the children, right? And even adding that into story time. So if we're again talking about this imaginary dog, we can talk about the children having pets at home, but we also can use the word for dog in the children's language, right? So really thinking about how we make those connections. And so as we've reviewed our key ideas, and really these 4 strategies as we think about facilitation of learning and development, and we think about story time, we always want to pause and think about, okay, what are some of the challenges? What are some of the causes to pause of where we go? You know, that all sounds great, Joanna, but at the end of the day, that's not my experience, right? And so what can be some challenges in terms of sharing books with children and what that looks like? And so if folks can share some of their challenges in the chat, I see here, Alida, you're using props might be a challenge. It also might be a really good strategy, right? Sometimes we can have behaviorally that it gets in the way a little bit, right? Or maybe children start throwing things or putting things in their mouth, but sometimes having something concrete to hold on to can help kids stay engaged and pay attention, right? One of the things that I was thinking about with the picture on this previous slide, right, is that not only is the teacher sharing books with the children and reading Goodnight Moon, but the children also are looking at books at themselves, right? And so that's helping them to stay engaged. And I'm seeing some examples here in terms of behaviors, in terms of distractions. Sometimes there can be distractions coming from the program of where somebody comes into the classroom, they want to talk to you. I always feel really bad when I'm doing a classroom observation and the administrator comes in, I think trying to be supportive and wants to tell me all of this information. Or maybe is talking to the teacher, and actually it's impacting the observation because I'm supposed to be focused on the interactions between the teacher and the children, right? I was in a family childcare home and the provider's husband wanted to have a whole conversation with me, and I was trying to be respectful, especially because I'm in his home, right? But finally his wife told him to be quiet. I see here other things making the story interesting, finding developmentally appropriate books, right? All of these things. So lots of great challenges that you've been experiencing. So I appreciate folks sharing their ideas, right? And sometimes we just have to say, it's just not working today, and we're not going to continue this book. Maybe we're not going to continue storytelling and we're going to move on to something else. Sometimes it's that the children's behavior is communicating very clearly that they need to move. And so we have to move into a more active experience, right? Okay, so we're going to shift and move from our key ideas into really thinking about what are these strategies before story time, during story time, and after story time. And you'll probably see some similarities to what we talked about in terms of facilitated exploration, is that the first step is planning, right? And really knowing your children, thinking about where the children are developmentally, thinking about what they're interested in. And so making sure that the books that you're choosing and that you're planning on sharing with children are ones that are going to catch and hold their attention. And, you know, I think this is why also we have to be a little bit creative in how we think about this, right? So I've shared with you some of my favorite books and some of the books that my children really enjoyed and that I share with educators that are entering the field. But sometimes the best book isn't actually a book, right? In terms of something that we purchase. It might be a photo album of the children's families, of the children at school doing things. As I said, the topic that is most interesting to a toddler is themselves, right? They love seeing pictures of themselves, seeing pictures of their family. And so in work that I do for a company that publishes a curriculum that's used pretty predominantly in early childhood. There's this great video of the provider in a big comfortable chair with a young child, probably a 2.5-year-old, I'm going to guess, sharing a photo album and walking through and talking about the pictures, talking about the individuals in that picture, telling stories about the families, telling stories about what those pictures are, right? You can also make books. It was actually, when I was a 1-year-old teacher, we were required to make something that was part of our curriculum every week. So either I would be making games or books, right? And so you can, again, in the same video, there's this great section of talking to parents, and parents talking about how they make books for their children, right? One of them took Post-it notes and like stapled it together. One of them used Ziploc baggies, right? And so she put different things in each bag. That was a different page. And so it was kind of like a, we think about the crinkly books and the rubbery books for our really young children that they're going to put in their mouth or you play with during bath time and all those things. And would like cut out, she put in one a bit of a label from the child's diapers because the child liked that, and cut out magazine pictures of things that the child enjoyed, and pictures of the family, and it was really engaging for the child, right? And so it doesn't even have to be a store-bought book, and it also doesn't necessarily even have to be a book that thinking about when are there those opportunities for storytelling, right? And talking about things that have happened at school, talking about things that have happened in the children's lives, talking about things that are part of your life, right? That is also storytelling. That is also supporting a lot of these same things, right? So really knowing our children and taking the time to plan and be intentional. We also want to make sure that we're not like that politician showing up with a 60-page book that was intended for, college graduates, high school graduates. I was doing an observation in a 1-year-old classroom a few years ago in DC. And I was using a tool that focused more on the environment than interactions. But the entire time I was there, 3 hours, the children were in a whole group. And the teacher, who had the best of intentions, but clearly did not understand child development, had these 1-year-old babies sitting at a table. And then she had an elementary level book about apples that she read, or apple trees, about trees. That's right. It was about trees. So she shared this book about trees that was really a fact-based book that we would share at elementary level, probably even second grade. Like, it was a pretty complex book. And she was sharing it because then she was moving into an art activity, which had no art to it, of where she had cut out the different construction pieces of an apple tree and then proceeded to glue it together for each child. So there was a lot of sitting and waiting with nothing to do. But also it just wasn't developmentally appropriate and the children were not interested in the book, right? Okay. So then thinking about, well, what does this actually look like during storytelling? And so as I referenced as we were getting started, you have to make it fun. You have to be excited. It has to be books that you enjoy as well. I actually had a rule, though we recently had a family conversation where my children told me they weren't really all that excited about that rule. But when they were little, I wouldn't let them watch a show that I didn't want to watch, right? Because, I just couldn't have it on in the household all of the time. And so really thinking about that, you have control over the books and materials that are in your classroom, right? And so really thinking about, how do you choose books that are developmentally appropriate, that represent the children and the languages spoken by the children in your classroom or in your program, but also are books that you enjoy and that you want to read 50 times, right? Because children want to read the same book over and over and over again. I also had to recognize, particularly when I was working with 1-year-olds, that books are consumables, which means they're just like art materials. They're going to get used up and they need to be replaced. We had a book, it was an Elmo book, and it had all of those little windows, right, that you would open up. My children loved that book, but those windows often got pulled off, right? And so that was a book that we replaced a couple of times because it was a favorite. And I wasn't going to tell them not to look at it, right? So we have to have enthusiasm. We have to make it fun. But we also have to think about the fact that it is the child who is in control, that we are following children's lead. And so making sure that when we're sharing books, we're not being controlling. We're not hyper focused on making it from page 1 to the back of the book. Because sometimes children aren't interested, and sometimes it might be that you move around between pages and you're having conversations, right? And so this is what gets us to the second piece, is that we have to be flexible, right? Sometimes it's just not going to go the way that we think it is. And so we have to be able to shift and change. And it may be that we read the book in a different order. It may be that we read a different book. It may be that we move to a different activity, right? But giving children opportunities for leadership, for really actively participating, not only by asking questions and giving space for children to respond, but letting them turn pages, giving them props that go along with the story, especially if we get into, excuse me, our older toddlers, that you can have them participate, that at different times they're holding up that prop, right? But again, having something concrete to hold on to helps maintain their attention and focus, right? Letting them act out the story, making sure that the book and the props are available and are in the environment for children to use outside of story time, right? To really extend that. One of the things I did, and we had something called an art waxer. I haven't been able to find it, but I would color in pictures. I would usually I just got a colored book. I'm not all that artistic, but that was connected to a story. And then I would laminate it, and then I would put it through this thing called the art waxer that put a layer of wax on the bottom, and it would stick to the wall. And I would put these on the wall and children could pull them off and put them back on, right? They thought that was the best thing ever. And being able to manipulate that and making connections to those props to the stories that we were telling, right? Okay, so we've talked about what we do before in that planning piece, and we've talked about what we do during. And so then this is what we do after. And again, it really is that reflective process and really thinking about, were children engaged? Were they participating? If children are not engaged, if they're not participating when you're sharing books and stories, if they're doing something else, typically they're not learning, right? Also, typically they're doing something that you don't want them to do, and you're having to stop to respond to challenging behaviors, right? And I think it gets back to some of the things that you identified as challenges that you've experienced during story time, right? But then to really think and reflect, well, when are times that they are engaged? When are what are those experiences that we've had in sharing books? And kind of getting back to the question I asked right at the top of our time together of, What are books that you really like to share with children? What are books that they really enjoy? And think about, what is it about that book that they like so much, right? What are things that I did when I was sharing that book that made that successful, right? Thinking about the books that we choose. And again, are there those mirrors and windows of where children see themselves, but also are exposed to things that maybe they don't see every day? And ideally, in a diverse program, the things that are mirrors for one child are windows for another, right? But to really think about, what could you have done differently? Again, I think back to this practicum that I used to be the instructor for. And I had another student who was in a preschool classroom. And as part of the practicum, they were required to write out a lesson plan. And then the idea was really that when I was coming to observe, I was observing them implementing that lesson plan. And so with this one student who was in a practicum space, it was not her workspace. And I think she really was brand new, it didn't have a lot of experience. And she wanted me to observe her large group, and she was reading a book, and it was like herding cats. Like, these kids were not engaged in any way, shape, or form. But I think because I was observing her and because this was what was on her plan, she kind of felt like she had to just move ahead with the plan and kind of, drive through. And it was kind of painful. And so I think we have to have that flexibility and shift in the moment. But even when we're not successful in getting kids' attention, that we take the time to really reflect and think about, ooh, I'm not going to do that again, right? And what was it with that? I think back to my first teaching job, where, boy, I was so young. I didn't know what I didn't know. But, and these were 3-year-olds, but Washington State, at the time, the group size was 30, which was insane. It was still a 1-to-10 ratio. So we had 30 kids in the room, 3 teachers. One of the teachers I worked with was verbally abusive. Another was an alcoholic. So the afternoon was kind of was shot for her. And we ran the classroom as 3 separate classrooms. Like, we just sort of were in the same space, but we just had our 10 children. And I was the closer, right? So the other 2 teachers had earlier hours. And so when the second teacher went home, I think at 5 o'clock, and I was there till 6, I often had a lot of kids by myself. I think it was like, there were times I had like 15 kids or something by myself, which clearly was against licensing. Again, I was really young and I didn't know that I shouldn't have accepted that. But I would come up with all these intricate plans of things to do at the end of the day because I wanted to keep kids engaged, because otherwise I was responding to challenging behaviors and all of those kinds of things. So one day we decided to make bread. And I was having the children stir and then knead the dough. And I was talking about the yeast that we had put in the dough. And I made the mistake of saying that it's kind of like, I said it was alive. And so then the children thought like there was bugs or something in the dough, and then they didn't want to touch it and they all got freaked out, right? And so thinking through, how did this go? Like, overall, I thought it was a pretty good activity, and it did keep the kids engaged, until they all thought that the dough was like teeming with invisible bugs that were going to bite them or something. And then I just lost the whole group, right? So again, the reflection piece is really important. Okay, so as we think about all of these strategies that we've been talking about, our key ideas, what we do during or before, during, and after story time, we're now going to watch a video of what this looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and take us into my browser. And I think this is the video. And I'm going to go ahead and share this video.
And it is broken. That is orange, and it's a picture of a room. And we're learning about homes right now. And we're learning about what's that is fire. Fire's hot, right?
It's like all water.
We're learning about what we find in our homes.
Yeah.
And yes, we could have a fireplace in our home. What else? A bed. He's going to sleep in his bed.
Yes. And I got that one. I got Susan.
That's a rug. That's like a rug on the floor. Like kind of like this.
That's like a
Kinda like this.
tiger leg.
Yeah.
It's sticky.
And a picture of, that is sticky, it's honey. The cow jumping over the moon. And there were, you can jump over the moon?
Yeah.
There were 3 little bears sitting on chairs. And 2 little kittens. Can you find the kittens?
1, 2.
1,
You see house.
2. I see the house.
This mouse.
Can anybody find a tiny little mouse in this picture? There he is. Look at the tiny little mouse. Good job.
I see it.
You see him? He's tiny.
I see mouse.
And 2
see
little
mice out
kittens
there.
and a pair of mittens and a little toy house
I see house.
and a young mouse. Yeah.
And toys in the house.
Yep, that's all different things we can find in a home. Remember, we're learning about what we can find in a home.
Okay, so we saw lots of things, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and take us back into my slide deck. And actually, I'm going to take us back through the content a little bit, right? To kind of help us remember and reflect and summarize on all of these strategies. So as I'm walking through and sharing, I want to invite you to share in the chat, what are some things that you noticed in that video? What are some things connected to these strategies that we talked about, right? So thinking about how it is that we actively guide interactions, and what are things that we saw this teacher do in terms of ways that she supported their engagement. Did we hear her say anything that connected to children's lives, to children's experiences, right? Then thinking about some of our ideas here connected to key idea number 3, right? And ask, do we hear her ask questions? Did she give time for children to respond, right? What kinds of questions did she ask based upon the age of the children, right? And then did we see her focusing on specific details of the book, of the stories, right? And so we see, and I see, Lola, that you identified that one of the children really wasn't all that interested, right? But she was looking at her own book, right? She wasn't being disruptive. And maybe she was listening. We don't really know. Like sometimes it seems like that child that you think is completely tuned out will then make a comment about what's been going on and is like spot on, right? But yeah, she didn't seem all of that interested, right? And then thinking about, picking the books beforehand. And how did she really set the stage and picking a book that had different pictures and things that might be interesting to the children. But also having other books available that children were able to look at, right? And thinking about when perhaps we didn't really see her shift, but how she could have, right? And what were some opportunities perhaps that would have engaged the other child, right? But this was also a 2-minute video. So usually we can hold their interest for at least that, right? But we saw enthusiasm and we saw how she was really engaging the children, right? And of course, we want to have our reflection piece after the fact. And so again, in our last few moments, I do want to actually take us back into the video. Because now that we've walked through and kind of reviewed, right, it's always important to have that opportunity to review and reflect I'm going to go ahead and play this video again, and I want you to really be paying attention to and noticing some of these things.
And it is broken. That is.
So right off the bat, she's responsive to the children, right? This little guy makes a comment, I assume, about the book, and she acknowledges and repeats it, right? And so you see some of that back and forth of where she's not being controlling. She's not determined to read the book from front to back, and not pause, that there really is an awareness and a responsiveness.
Is orange, and it's a picture of a room. And we're learning about homes right now. And we're learning about what's that is fire. Fire.
So she's making connections to the curriculum and what they're focusing on, right? And maybe she could even then make some connections to children's homes and what their homes look like and what's in their home. And is it similar to what's in the pictures of the book?
It's hot, right?
It's like all water.
We're learning about what we find in our homes.
Yeah.
And yes, we could have a fireplace in our home. What else? A bed. He's going to sleep in his bed.
Yes. And I don't know that one. I don't Susan.
That's a rug. That's like a rug on the floor. Like kind of like this.
That's like a
Kind of like this.
tiger leg.
Yeah.
It's sticky.
And a pit.
And so we see this back and forth conversation around the pictures, right? And thinking about that, the opportunities for children to be actively engaged and involved, she's allowing the children to point to different things in the book, and she's allowing the children to really dictate the pacing that they go through the story, and the things that they're interested in talking about.
Picture of, that is sticky, it's honey. The cow jumping over the moon. And there were, you can jump over the moon?
Yeah.
There were 3 little bears sitting on chairs. And 2 little kittens. Can you find the kittens?
Right? Sticky.
And here's a great example of how we can ask questions in ways that are developmentally appropriate. And so the children may not respond to an open-ended question, but we want to ask those, right? And give that space. And maybe it's that we're responding ourselves. But she's also asking concrete questions in terms of where's the kitten, and having children respond by pointing to the kitten, right? And so that labeling piece is also important in terms of how we support language.
1, 2, I see the house.
This mouse.
Can anybody find a tiny little mouse in this picture? There he is. Look at the tiny little mouse. Good job.
I see it.
You see him? He's tiny.
Okay, and so finally, I'll just point out that we see some of that enthusiasm in terms of her smiling and changes in intonation, and even how she talks about the tiny little mouse and how that you can sense that excitement, right? Okay, so I know we are at the end of our time, and so I am going to take us to our last slide. So I've really enjoyed taking our time together. I'm always super excited to be able to talk about infants and toddlers. So please let me know if you have any questions. You can put them in the chat. And I'm going to turn again to Carmen and Christina in terms of wrapping us up and where you all go next.
Thank you, Ms. Parker. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wonderful stories, that made us all reflect on our practice in the classroom. Yes.